Hey guys, imagine you are an old philosopher living a peaceful life happily buried in your scrolls, studying philosophy, classifying animals, dissecting logic, and dreaming of a quiet life surrounded by ancient manuscripts. Then one day, there is a knock on the door. And someone says, "Hey sir, could you please teach this kid how to be a king?" And just like that, Aristotle, the legendary teacher, the bald-headed sage of wisdom, the master of every system of thought, was handed a mission that even Google Translate would throw its hands up at train a 13-year-old boy to become Alexander the Great. Yes, you heard that right. A kid who would rather swing a sword than hold a pen. A rebellious student backed by an entire empire. And Aristotle had to figure out how to teach not just a person, but a future god, without getting his own head chopped off if he got it wrong. Before I dive into this saga of comedy, tragedy, and plot twists, you will never find in any philosophy textbook if you are also into history stories that make you go, "Wait, what?" The more you listen, then do not forget to hit like and follow the channel, so every week we can uncover those jaw-dropping moments of civilization that your school books conveniently skipped over. And leave a comment telling me where you are listening from. Because whether you are in Athens, Austin, or just eating dinner, you are right here with me in the wildest classroom of the ancient world. This is not just about philosophy and thrones. It is about the eternal question humanity keeps asking. How do you teach someone who loves to rule? How to be human? You are living inside the mind of a Greek teacher, whose name you probably cannot even spell. If you have ever asked, what is politics? Should ethics follow reason or emotion? Or even just studied math, physics, or biology? Congratulations. You are living inside the intellectual prison designed by Aristotle. But do not worry, this prison comes with a library, a laboratory, and a full-blown classroom, because he built those too. Aristotle did not invent the world. He rewrote it, piece by piece, leaf by leaf. Every human behavior, even the footprint of a seagull on the sand, was worth analyzing. If the universe is like a cluttered iPhone full of confusing apps, then Aristotle was the first guy who sat down and wrote the user manual for all of humanity. Before Google search existed, Aristotle was manually searching with his eyes, his hands, and a brain so powerful that even if you installed artificial intelligence in it, it might not get any smarter. The only question is, why did he do it? And how did he do it so well that more than 2,000 years later, the whole world still learns? The way he taught to understand that, forget the image of a philosopher meditating under a tree. Aristotle did not live like a philosopher. He lived like a content creator with ADHD, but with the discipline of a samurai. In the morning, he wrote about logic. At noon, he classified animals. In the afternoon, he lectured on ethics. At night, he debated with students about the meaning of happiness. Every single day. No holidays, no mental health breaks, and absolutely no Netflix. This is the kind of man who, if he were alive today, would definitely be the admin of a Facebook page called something like Gentle Philosophy for the Overthinking Soul. But that is just the surface. Beneath it all was this: Aristotle did not write just for fun. He wrote to teach a boy who might one day rule the world. That is right. This man was the first mentor in human history to be hired not to teach a child how to read, but how to build an empire. And that boy, none other than Alexander the Great. And Aristotle, he held in his hands the first ever blueprint on how to train a warrior to become a ruler. How do you teach him in a way that he does not turn into a tyrant? How do you teach ethics while also preparing him to lead armies into 30 nations? Teaching a regular student is already hard. Teaching someone who is going to reshape history is a whole different level. But we will get to Alexander soon. Let's go back to Aristotle, because before he could teach anyone how to be a king, he had to first turn himself into the king of knowledge. And the way he did that, by not leaving a single field untouched. Philosophy wrote about it. Political science wrote about it. Psychology wrote about it. Rhetoric wrote about it. Zoology wrote about it. Botany wrote about it. Astronomy wrote about it. Poetics wrote about it. He even developed a system for analyzing tragic poetry, like he was reviewing Oscar-winning movies. In other words, Aristotle created the content for the entire modern education system. Imagine this: you are a Greek citizen in 340 BC, waking up every day to find your teacher sketching diagrams, dissecting fish, reciting poetry, and asking impossible questions like, does the soul have weight? What do? You either run away or you become a philosophy fan for life. There is no third option. The scary part was not just that he wrote so much, but that he got so much of it right. Aristotle did not guess. He observed, recorded, organized, and restructured the way humans think, starting from our instincts. You know this phrase, man is a rational animal. That is Aristotle. You have heard of syllogistic logic, also Aristotle. You once believed that heavier objects fall faster. Yep. That was Aristotle too, even though Galileo later called him out. But hey, who has not made a small mistake after writing 3,000 pages non-stop? What made Aristotle extraordinary was not that he got everything right. It was that he was the first to try to understand the world with reason, not myth. In an age when Zeus was hurling lightning bolts every time thunder struck, Aristotle was asking, but wait, do clouds actually carry electricity? When everyone thought wisdom came from the gods, Aristotle replied, knowledge comes from observation. In short, he did not turn knowledge into a divine mystery. He made it human, and that changed history. We are about to dive into a dramatic past, from the boy who became an empire and the teacher who became a legend. But before we go any further, remember this: you might not know who Aristotle is, but you are thinking with ideas he wrote 2,400 years ago. Not everyone becomes a king, but everyone, whether they know it or not, has been a student of Aristotle. Up next, we meet that very special student, Alexander, the boy who did not know fear, did not know rest, and did not know failure, and the teacher, the one who did not teach how to kill, but how to understand the world before deciding whether it was worth killing for. Before Aristotle became the man who rewrote the human brain, he was just a sad little boy. His mother passed away early. His father, who happened to be the personal physician to the king of Macedon, did not live much longer either. And so young, big-headed, and without a family, Aristotle was sent to Plato's academy in Athens, the elite hangout spot for philosophy nerds of the time. But think of it like this: enrolling in Plato's academy, while not liking Plato's idea of the ideal world, was like joining Taylor Swift's fan club, but only listening to Metallica. Plato believed that the real world was just a warped shadow of an ideal one. To understand reality, you had to dream, to meditate, to explore the depths of your soul. But Aristotle, he looked at a table and said, "A table is a table. Do not ask me to imagine some divine version of it, a realist to the bone." Their teacher-student dynamic: think the teacher floats, the student stays grounded. While Plato soared in the realm of abstract ideas, Aristotle rolled around in chicken coops watching roosters flirt. There were moments Plato probably looked at his young student and thought, if this kid becomes famous one day, it sure will not be because of me. Still, even though he did not buy into the philosophy, Aristotle learned everything there was to learn. Because he did not rebel. He analyzed. The kind of student who loved arguing with the question and still aced the exam. After 20 years under Plato's roof, yes, 20 years, not 2, Aristotle left the academy with a mind full of knowledge and a heart full of doubts. Imagine studying for 2 decades and graduating with the line, "Thank you for teaching me. Everything I am about to prove is not quite enough." Plot twist, that was the first step in Aristotle becoming the founder of a new kind of philosophy. One that did not just live in books, but lived out in the real world. He did not just walk out of the classroom. He walked away from Athens itself, the intellectual capital of the world. Because after Plato died, Aristotle was not chosen to lead the academy. Why? Maybe because he was a foreigner. Maybe because he was just too stubborn. Either way, Aristotle packed his bags and entered his era of philosophy freelancing. And then fate handed him the most important chapter of his life. King Philip II of Macedon sent him a message. Okay, no phones back then, but imagine a fancy scroll asking, "Hey bro, can you teach my son how to be king?" And Aristotle said yes. Just imagine you are a wandering philosopher, and suddenly you get the gig of tutoring the kid who would one day become Alexander the Great. If someone told you today you are going to train a 13-year-old to become the ruler of Europe, Egypt, and the Middle East, what would you think? As for Aristotle, he got to work. No resume, no salary negotiation, because he knew this was bigger than fame, bigger than money. This was philosophy shaking hands with politics, a rare moment in history. But before we get to Alexander, let us go back to Aristotle, who was now dusting off Plato's curriculum, ready to rebuild it from the ground up. So what did he write? Everything. Logic. For the first time systematized into a true thinking tool, not just something you use to win arguments over dinner. Politics. A breakdown of all forms of government from monarchy to republic. Ethics. An analysis of what good means based not on divine will, but on human behavior. Art. A structural breakdown of tragedy defining catharsis, centuries before modern critics knew the term. Biology. Observing, describing, and classifying more than 500 animal species. He even dove into dreams, memory, and emotion. Basically a psychologist before psychology had a name. And he did all this without Google, without a microscope, without a lab. Just eyes, ears, brain, and a willpower carved out of granite. The books Aristotle wrote were not dreamy philosophy essays. They were user manuals for life. Want to run a city? Read Politics. Want to understand lasting happiness? Read Nicomachean Ethics. Want to write a play that makes people cry like a thunderstorm? Hit the theater. Read Poetics. Each book was a brick in the castle of Western thought, and each sentence was a slap in the face to the conspiracy theories of the time. But what scared people most, Aristotle wrote down things others had not even begun to think about. And when people finally did start thinking about those things, they realized, he was right. He did not wait for the world to validate him. He created the framework by which the world would validate everything else. If Plato built castles in the clouds, then Aristotle drew the map on how to climb those clouds without breaking your neck. In the next part, we will see how Aristotle took that philosophy and programmed the mind of Alexander the Great. Because teaching a well-behaved child is already hard. But teaching a child who wants to conquer the world while keeping his head cool and his heart warm, now that is philosophy. Real philosophy. If you think the first school was some place with a front gate, a soccer field, and a hall monitor guarding the entrance well, Aristotle would be delighted to prove you completely wrong. His school, the Lyceum, had no classrooms, no bells, and no blackboards. It was a park. That is right. Aristotle opened a school outdoors. Sounds a little hippie now, but it was a stroke of genius. Because back then, schools did not need desks. They needed moving minds. And Aristotle, like any thoughtful content creator, understood one simple truth: people think best when they walk. So he led his students on walks through groves of trees, lecturing as they moved, discussing politics while strolling, debating ethics while watching butterflies. And because he was always walking while teaching, his students were called peripatetics, literally meaning those who learn while walking. If he lived today, he would probably start something called TED Walk, not talk. The Lyceum had no uniforms, no attendance sheets, and no final exams. But if you stepped inside, you were walking into a temple of intellect. In that place, every question was dissected down to the bone. From do fish have souls to is love an instinct or a social construct, every topic was debated with a cool head and possibly a glass of wine. Aristotle's school was nothing like Plato's academy, where students wrestled with lofty ideals and perfect forms. His school was where you learned how to live, right, think clearly, and deal with the real world. His students were not bookish nerds with glasses. They were nobles, diplomats, warriors, merchants, people who needed sharp thinking to run entire city-states. This was not just a school. It was a national leadership training center. And Aristotle, he was the principal professor, researcher, janitor, and in-house book reviewer. But the most unique thing about Lyceum was not the content. It was the method. While most ancient academies were still stuck in monologues, the teacher spoke, the students copied. Aristotle asked questions. Lots of them. Why do you think that? What if that assumption is wrong? Is there any evidence that disproves your theory? He taught his students to think critically, to question even their deepest beliefs. At the Lyceum, thinking was sharpened like a blade, not to hurt anyone, but to cut through the tangled mess of nonsense that life throws into your brain. And then one fateful day, while the school was thriving, while students were still pacing the grounds, arguing whether the soul has weight, Aristotle got a call from history. "Hey Aristotle, this is Philip of Macedon. I have a kid, Alexander. He is hitting puberty, has a thing for power. Can you teach him?" At the time, Aristotle was 41 years old, tired of Athens, tired of idealism, tired of people who preached morality but could not even sell a chicken in the market. And he accepted. But teach whom, Alexander? Not your average child. A boy who would one day march through Asia, conquer Egypt and Persia, and even try invading India just to see what is up. And Aristotle realized this was not just a student. This was an intellectual investment. So he returned to his homeland Macedonia, not to open a school, but to open a private class for one single child. And that class did not start with A is for apple. It started with, what is justice? Should a government serve the people or the king? Do the talented have the right to rule the weak? How do you kill a king without becoming a tyrant? These were not dry philosophy lessons. They were moral manuals for someone with the potential to set the world on fire. Aristotle knew one thing: he could not stop Alexander from going to war. But he could stuff one thing into that kid's head: responsibility. The responsibility that comes with power is not like wielding a sword. It is like holding the universe. During this time, Aristotle gave Alexander the Iliad, the epic of war, honor, and the fall of heroes. And he did not just hand him the book. He edited it, annotated it, highlighted it like a modern self-help guide. Alexander loved that version so much. He carried it into battle. And every action, every wild and bloody decision he made later on somehow echoed the influence of the teacher who once taught philosophy from a stone bench. Alexander never became a philosopher, but he became living proof of a philosophy that could bleed, but never lose meaning. And just like that, Aristotle, the man once rejected by Athens, once a student who dared to argue with his teacher, became the first national educator who taught how to rule with reason. As for Alexander, we will meet him again soon, when the world at his feet starts to tremble. But for now, let us return to Aristotle, the man who turned a park into a university, turned students into kings, and turned philosophy into a weapon of leadership. In the next part, we will see how he used that very knowledge to expand his reach, writing books, studying animals, and transforming all of nature into a living classroom of philosophy. If you think teaching a classroom full of rich kids is a challenge, try teaching someone who could wake up tomorrow and become emperor. And then by sunset, decide to casually march his army to conquer Egypt. Welcome to the most unusual classroom in history, a class with one student named Alexander and one teacher named Aristotle. This class had no grades, no quizzes, but it could decide the fate of dozens of nations. The student was the son of Philip II, king of Macedon, who at the time was sharpening his swords to expand his empire. Alexander, just 13 years old, had already memorized epic poetry, rode horses without a saddle, and completely flunked humility. He was not the obedient type. Brilliant, but arrogant. Brave, but impulsive. And Philip, instead of sending his son to the battlefield early, decided to hire a legendary master to reprogram his mind. That is when Aristotle stepped in. No standard curriculum, no lab equipment. Just one mission: teach this kid not to become a tyrant. To be clear, Aristotle was not just hired to teach him how to read. He was hired to install a moral operating system into someone who would one day hold the power of life and death over millions. And you think he started with books? No. He started with nature. He took Alexander into the forest, pointed at an ant, see that highly organized, works for the collective. But what happens if the ant becomes king? Then he pointed at an eagle, see that soars high, sees far, but also kills with its claws. Do not just learn how to see, learn when not to strike. That was Aristotle's style. He did not cram knowledge. He planted seeds of doubt. He gave Alexander the Iliad, but not to memorize, to challenge it. Achilles kills for honor. But what is honor, really? What does victory mean if it leaves you living in fear and rebellion? Alexander did not just memorize, he debated. And at that moment, Aristotle knew this boy is dangerous, but trainable. Time passed and Alexander evolved into a hybrid between a philosopher and a warrior. He did not just sit and write poems, nor did he fight for fun. He thought. And that was the one thing Aristotle had embedded deep in him. You see leaders today going to workshops to learn leadership skills. Aristotle was doing that over 2,300 years ago. But this was not a one-way relationship. What few people mention is Alexander also changed Aristotle, seeing a boy with the power to reshape the world. Aristotle understood something: philosophy could not live only on paper. It had to breathe. It had to work. It had to be strong enough to restrain a sword vibrating with battle lust. So for 3 years, Aristotle taught relentlessly, not just philosophy, but science, medicine, rhetoric, even statecraft. Imagine being Alexander. In the morning, you classify insects. In the afternoon, you study strategic maps. At night, you debate the meaning of justice. It was like Harvard meets West Point, but with no whiteboards, no PowerPoint. Just one bearded man whose intellect could stop you in your tracks. And Aristotle understood his student perfectly. He did not forbid Alexander from fighting. He simply asked, "If you win everything, then what will you be, the ruler of a terrified empire, or one that admires you?" That was how Aristotle taught. Not with high ideals, but with strategies of the soul. By the time Alexander turned 16, he left the classroom carrying a head full of knowledge, and a copy of the Iliad personally edited and annotated by Aristotle himself. It was not just a book, it was a compass. Alexander once said, "I received my sword from my father, and the Iliad from my teacher." Plot twist. He kept that book with him on every campaign, treating it almost like a warrior's scripture. And you know what that means. It means Aristotle did not just teach successfully. He carried philosophy out of the classroom and onto the battlefield. Of course, real life is not a cartoon. Alexander would go on to invade half of Asia, burn cities, and crush dozens of kings. But even in those bloody conquests, there were moments when he spared civilians, protected doctors, or negotiated peace. That was the Aristotle seed that survived. Sadly, this teacher-student bond did not last forever. After Alexander became king, the distance grew. Some records say he started to suspect his teacher of political plotting. Others say he was simply too busy conquering to talk ethics anymore. Whatever the reason, Aristotle knew, "I cannot control him anymore. I can only hope what I taught will resurface when it matters most." And that is the destiny of every teacher, to give everything, and then step aside as the student goes off to make history. In the next part, we will return to Aristotle, no longer a tutor, but now the ultimate author, forging intellectual weapons for all of humanity. If you think Aristotle only wrote philosophy, wait until you see him break down how a crab walks. If you imagine Aristotle as the kind of guy who spent his days in a toga brooding over the essence of nothingness, then you are way off. He was not just a philosopher, he was a hands-on science geek. And by hands-on, we mean the kind who chased bugs, dissected fish, and took detailed notes on how a fly moves its wings. Yes, he was probably the only philosopher in history who could deliver a lecture on ethics, and then pull a sea urchin out of his robe to analyze. After finishing his gig as private tutor to a future emperor, Aristotle returned to Athens, but not to sit quietly. He came back to unleash an encyclopedia on the world. He reopened the Lyceum version too. But this time it was not just about teaching thinking. It was about researching everything under the sun. Literally. Plants observed, animals dissected, human behavior analyzed, rain, thunder, lightning recorded like a weather station, the movement of the moon charted, the emotional impact of music theorized. If GoPro cameras had existed back then, he probably would have strapped one to his head and walked around like a live streaming National Geographic channel. Aristotle set up an entire research center at the Lyceum, called the Yawn, yes, the ancestor of the word museum, filled with thousands of biological specimens, manuscripts, research notes, bird feathers, fish skulls, and a bunch of other stuff only he could sort through. His motto, "To understand the world, you have to touch it." At a time when knowledge was still the playground of mythology, when people believed thunder was Zeus being grumpy, black cats were omens, and wind was the breath of the god Oilus, Aristotle stood up and said, "I do not need gods. I need evidence." He described over 500 animal species. He categorized different reproductive systems. He realized dolphins are not fish. They are mammals. Yes, he figured that out 2,000 years before humans invented the microscope. And he did not just observe. He wrote biology books. His most famous one, History of Animals, which was basically Wikipedia for the ancient world. In it, he did not tell cute stories. He analyzed. Why does a woodpecker have a long neck? Why is the heart of a fish located near the gills? Why can some reptiles regrow their tails? And here is the magical part. Many of his conclusions were right. Not because he was lucky, but because he observed more carefully than anyone else. No modern tools, just time obsession and a brain that worked like an AI system nobody had coded yet. Aristotle did not write like in my opinion. He wrote like I watched this crab do that one day. Then it did it again. And again. So I tentatively conclude that was not philosophy. That was science before science had a name. Of course, he did not always get it right. He once claimed that men had more teeth than women, because he never actually counted. Tiny roast, even philosophers get lazy. But the way he thought, starting from data moving toward systems, is what made Aristotle the father of the scientific method. You know the scientific method: observe, hypothesize, test, conclude. Aristotle laid the foundation. Even though he never had access to a lab, he helped human thinking step away from blind faith and move closer to faith with evidence. And that made him a bit of an outcast among philosophers. Most thinkers of his time were still swimming in the sea of abstract ideas, while Aristotle was slicing open dragonflies to examine their circulatory systems. He was not adored like Plato, not mythologized like Socrates, but he was used. His students, readers, rulers, scientists, all used Aristotle's way of thinking like we use GPS. They could disagree with him, but they could not ignore him. And the amazing thing is, he never needed applause. He just wrote. Wrote by day, wrote by night, wrote until his wrist ached, because he believed to understand the world, to live rightly in the world. Even when he wrote about politics, it was through the lens of biology. A city is like a living organism. Law is the bloodstream. Citizens are the cells. The ruler is the heart. If it beats too hard, blood vessels burst. If it is too weak, the body collapses. His metaphors were not dreams. They were social autopsies. He even wrote about music. Yes, Aristotle, the guy who dissected squids, also wrote about how the lyre affects human emotions. His verdict: music can shape moral character. But it must be the right kind. If he lived today, he would probably be reviewing EDM tracks like a neuroscientist. And that is how Aristotle became history's first full-stack content creator. Philosophy, biology, art, politics, logic, psychology, natural sciences, all flowed from a single pen. And remember, he did not write to sell books. No publishers, no royalties, no fan page. He wrote because he wanted to leave his mind behind for the world. Soon, we will see that even though Aristotle was smart enough to make Google jealous, he was not immune to the traps of politics and public opinion. In the next part, we step into the darkest chapter, when Aristotle, for getting too close to power, began to be cancelled by the very city he once called home. Athens, the cradle of democracy, birthplace of philosophers, poets, and great minds, was also the holy land of cancel culture in the ancient world. Say the wrong thing, executed. Act differently, exiled. Write philosophy while being friends with a foreign king. Sorry, you have just been unfriended by the intellectual community. And that is exactly what happened to Aristotle. After years of research, writing, and teaching, he thought he was safe in his elder of knowledge status. But no. Athens does not forget, does not forgive, does not let go. They remembered one thing very clearly: he was close friends with the king of Macedon, and his star student, none other than Alexander the Great, the man who had crushed the Greek city-states with both sword and crown. Let us break down the situation. Alexander had become ruler of half the known world. Athens, meanwhile, was a fading shadow of its former glory. And in their frustration over being ruled, the people began looking for someone to blame. No one dared go after Alexander. That would be suicide. But Aristotle, an old man with gray hair and books living in the middle of Athens, much easier target. So they began to dig. This guy taught Alexander. He must be a spy. He is not even one of us. He is from Macedon. He wrote that the soul is not divine. Blasphemy, sound, familiar, that is right. Aristotle got hit with the same playbook they used on Socrates, because as you probably know, Athens had a long tradition of executing philosophers as a way to blow off political steam. Years earlier, they had forced Socrates to drink poison for the crime of corrupting the youth with ideas. And now Aristotle could see the democratic dagger being sharpened again, this time for him. Some sources say he once remarked, "I will not let Athens commit the same crime against philosophy twice." And with that, he quietly left. No trial, no defense, no clarification video. He packed up his scrolls, his notes, his specimens, and canceled himself before they could. Aristotle retreated to Chalcis, a smaller, quieter city where no one asked him if he had ever taught Alexander. No podcasts, no press conferences, no public statements. Just a philosopher in early retirement, reflecting on the silence of knowledge in the face of politics. Bitter indeed. The man who laid the foundation of logic, branded a traitor. The man who classified 500 species, accused of insulting the gods. The man who taught live by reason, condemned for being too close to someone too powerful. But Aristotle did not react like a sore loser. He did not go online to post rants. He did not start a movement. He did not release a tell-all scroll about Athens. He just stayed silent and kept writing. Even when kicked out of the center of learning, he did not give up on thought. Even when people stopped listening, he kept leaving behind manuscript after manuscript, hoping that one day someone would read and understand. And eventually, people did. Hundreds of years later, during the Roman Empire, in the Islamic Golden Age, and through the European Renaissance, people dug up Aristotle's writings like gold buried in ashes. Each book, each note, was copied, preserved, translated into Arabic, then Latin, then English, then into the language you are reading right now. His knowledge rose like a phoenix. But here is the irony: Aristotle never lived to see it. He died quietly in Chalcis. No statues, no national mourning, no tribute tweets. Just an old man who once taught philosophy, dying in a time that could not handle philosophy. And that was the darkest chapter in Aristotle's life, when thought was not fast enough to outrun the blade of politics. But it is also what made him a legend. Not because he was always right, but because he always stayed loyal to his thinking, even when the world turned its back on him. You know, in a fictional letter reconstructed centuries later, there was a line, "If Alexander was an undefeated warrior, then Aristotle was the warrior who carried no sword." And sometimes it is those who carry no weapons who leave the deepest cuts on history. In the next part, we will explore how Aristotle, though cancelled in his own lifetime, left behind a colossal legacy for the entire world. A treasure trove of knowledge that, whether you are a scientist, an artist, a politician, or a TikToker, you are probably borrowing from every single day. If you have ever felt exhausted after writing 3 emails and fixing a couple of PowerPoint slides, let me introduce you to a certain someone, Aristotle, the man who built an entire content universe using nothing but ink paper and a brain that refused to rest. No editorial team, no AI assistant, no Notion, no Google Drive, just him, a philosopher with one mission: to decode the entire world. And he did not do this in some charming Lakeview cafe with jazz playing in the background. He did it in dusty, politically messy Athens, while juggling teaching, tutoring a king, and dodging cancel culture. And yet, he wrote. He wrote on ethics, Nicomachean Ethics, a book about how to be human, not just a morally programmed robot. He wrote on politics, mapping out every kind of government from monarchy to aristocracy to democracy, and pointing out the dark sides of each one. He wrote on logic organon, basically a toolkit to help you stop arguing like an idiot. He wrote on rhetoric. If you have ever watched a TEDx talk, you are witnessing Aristotle's techniques in action. He wrote on poetry, poetics, the first ever breakdown of story structure from conflict to climax to catharsis. Yes, even Hollywood borrowed from here. He wrote about biology, physics, psychology, astronomy, linguistics, literally a handwritten encyclopedia. All in all, he wrote about 200 major works, and that is the conservative estimate since over half of his writings have been lost forever. Did you know he even designed the first classification system for the sciences? That means before Wikipedia, he was building Wikipedia by hand. His thinking was clear, hierarchical, like the Excel spreadsheet of human knowledge. Everything you study today, from natural sciences to the humanities, still follows the intellectual structure he built. No exaggeration, this was the blueprint of the Western brain. So much so that during the Middle Ages, both Islamic and Christian universities considered Aristotle practically a prophet of reason. Muslim scholars called him al-Mu'allim al-Awwal, the first teacher. Christian scholars, even when they clashed with his ideas, still secretly taught Aristotle in monasteries. In fact, Thomas Aquinas, one of the greatest Catholic theologians, once time-traveled intellectually to team up with Aristotle to prove the existence of God using formal logic. And from there, Aristotle went from cancelled philosopher to the intellectual plug-in used by entire civilizations. His thinking crossed cultures, crossed religions, crossed entire millennia. Think only philosophy majors care about Aristotle, think again. If you have ever learned a cause and effect chart, that is Aristotle's thinking. If you have read a self-help book that divides people into 3 types, that is Aristotle's thinking. If you have watched a Hollywood movie with a 3-act structure, that is Aristotle's thinking. If you believe morality is not black and white but has gray areas, yep, Aristotle again. Even the quote, virtue is the golden mean between extremes, which sounds like modern psychological advice, that was Aristotle. He did not say, do not get angry. He said, get angry at the right time, at the right person, in the right way. Sounds like an emotional intelligence workshop Aristotle had the idea 2,400 years ago. And then you step back and realize modern knowledge is not a brand new discovery. It is an expansion of the seeds Aristotle already planted. So the big question, why did he write all this? Not for fame, not to be included in textbooks, not so Alexander could call him up and say, hey teacher, I just conquered another country. He wrote because he believed one simple thing all humans by nature desire to understand. That is the first sentence of metaphysics, and it was also his personal philosophy. Aristotle did not build temples, he built libraries. He did not invent religion, he invented systems of thought. He did not beg you to follow him, he simply offered a way of thinking and let you find your path. And the beauty is, he never demanded belief. Unlike many philosophers who wanted you to accept truth, Aristotle simply said, this is what I observed. This is how I understand it. Now what do you think? That intellectual humility is exactly why every culture respects him even when they disagree with him. But do not get it twisted. Aristotle was not some kindly old Gandalf of philosophy. He had strong opinions. He had principles. He got angry. But he never turned those into weapons. He turned them into lessons and wrote them down for the next generation to learn. So you may have never read Aristotle, but you are living in a world he wrote into existence. From the way you analyze problems, to how you argue, to how you judge morality, you are carrying his intellectual DNA. In the final part, we will reach the last chapter when Aristotle, the teacher once cast out, is finally honored by history as the architect of human thought. And you will understand why the teacher of Alexander ended up changing the world far more than the king who conquered it. Alexander is dead. The death of a man who conquered the world at just 32 years old did not come from battle or assassination. It came from illness, or maybe alcohol, or perhaps the crushing loneliness of being above everyone else. But more important than the death of Alexander is what lived on after him. Not his empire. It dissolved as fast as a splash of red wine. Not his dominance. His generals tore it apart like a blood-soaked version of the board game Risk. What lived on was his way of thinking, the thing he learned from Aristotle. And Aristotle. He had died a few years earlier, quietly with no kings, no glory, not even a grieving crowd. Just an old Greek man who had taught philosophy and written for over 30 years, abandoned by the very city he had served. Sounds like a sad ending. But let me tell you something, Aristotle did not need to live long. Because he lives on. The way he thought, the system he wrote down, did not just influence Alexander. It reshaped the way humanity understood the world for the next 2,000 years. Think about this. How many people in history have ruled as kings? Thousands. But how many people have created a framework of thought that allows anyone to think like a ruler? Only one. Aristotle. Alexander may have conquered Asia, but Aristotle conquered how humans analyze reality. And that is the difference. Force takes territory, but ideas claim memory. The truth is, if you carry a sword into battle, you might win once. But if you carry a mind sharp as a sword, you shape centuries. None of Alexander's successors became legends, but Aristotle's intellectual children, they became entire civilizations. European science was built on the logic he designed. Islamic philosophy followed the mental models he created. Renaissance art drew directly from his aesthetics. Modern politics still echoes his analysis from politics. Hollywood screenwriters still use the story structure he laid out in Poetics. Sounds exaggerated, it is not. During the Renaissance, when scholars resurrected ancient Greek knowledge whose name was mentioned more than any other, not Socrates, not Plato, Aristotle. And the world began to realize he was not just the teacher of Alexander. He was the teacher of anyone who ever tried to understand the universe using reason. Some later philosophers disagreed with him. Descartes, Hume, Kant, but none ignored him. You cannot do philosophy without passing through Aristotle, just like you cannot study math and skip arithmetic. Even today's sciences, though far more advanced in tools and data, still follow the same method he pioneered, thinking based on observation, classification, and systems. See something Aristotle got wrong. Great. He would want you to challenge it. That was his entire approach. Not I am right, but I am trying to understand correctly. Do you have better data? That spirit, a conversation between facts and reason, is what modern science tries to live by. Aristotle never wore a crown. He had no castle, no golden statues, no temples built in his name. But he built the map of human thought. And all of us, Whether we are engineers, writers, teachers, politicians, or first-year media students, are still using that map. You do not have to read Aristotle to understand him. You just have to have ever asked a question. Why do things work the way they do? What is morality? What is right? Is there proof? How do I convince someone with logic, not shouting, "Congratulations"? Aristotle just hacked your brain. You are thinking like someone who has been trained, even if you did not know it. And that is Aristotle's greatest victory. He taught the world without needing to control it. No crown, no army. No one even needed to say his name. Just the right questions, and the patience to chase them to the end. If Alexander was the fire that lit up all of Europe, then Aristotle was the silent wick that kept the flame alive. Fire burns out, but the wick, it stays waiting to be lit again. Every time humanity needs a spark to understand itself. So next time you stop to think before acting, question justice, or simply doubt a belief that sounds right but lacks proof, smile. Because Aristotle is patting you on the shoulder from across the millennia. Good job, kid. You're thinking.